So now we've moved on to an examination of bishops in minor piece play where both sides have the same color bishop as indicated here. The h3 and c8 bishops are both light squared bishops, but one side has the clearly superior bishop. Now, there are many things that can make up a superior bishop. A couple of things are evident in this position that would indicate that this bishop on h3 is the superior piece. To begin with, white has a better pawn structure, and this particular double pawn arrangement here is very problematic for black because this pawn on f5, it cannot move since the squares in order to advance are well guarded by white. So it's pretty much paralyzed here on f5, and very importantly, it's on a light square, meaning that, of course, the white bishop is able to target it, and we see that already the black bishop is just confined to this diagonal and limited to passive defense. The second the bishop attempts to move, it will cause the loss of this pawn on f5. Now, the one potential saving grace for black in this position is that these pawns here on c4 and d5, they're on light squares, meaning that black may be able to generate some kind of action with queen to b4, bishop to a6 against this weakness, and therefore distract white from being able to capture this pawn on f5. However, as we will see in the game, this possibility was simply not available, given the way that the next few moves unfolded. Now, the other thing that I want to just say is that although this presents some kind of counterplay for black, the reasons why black's bishop are inferior, as outlined already, the bishop is just passively defending, but there's a second reason as well, which partly ties down to these pawns, which is that, as we can see, white has a space advantage. And usually, when you have a space advantage, you simply have access to more squares. And as a result of this, the black bishop is, we can say that on the one hand, it can potentially generate counterplay against this weakness, but on the other, this structure is very much restricting the activity of the black bishop. For example, bishop to e6 or bishop to c6 or bishop to b5 are absolutely unavailable. And even if the bishop posts itself on a6, as long as this pawn is protected, then the bishop is not really doing much on this diagonal. So therefore, we can identify three factors already. Number one, the space advantage for white as a positive. Number two, the activity of this bishop for white here hitting this structural weakness. So this is a positive for white and a negative for black. And number three, which is the only positive factor working in black's favor, is that these pawns can potentially be vulnerable by virtue of their color placement. And so this is actually hitting on the very important point. I mean, now that we've established these kind of three factors, we can see that actually the white situation overall, I mean, with two very, very favorable factors and then one factor which is something that white has to watch out for, but he can more or less keep under control, we can definitely be quite confident that this position will be in white's favor. We can also add to this situation over here, or once we understand that the pawns on light squares are problematic as a general rule for white, because the black bishop is a light squared bishop and can therefore target it. Once we keep this in mind, and we also recognize this situation, which is, the same principle, we can also try and take a look at the other pawns. And we notice that, for example, white's remaining pawns are all on dark squares. And this is very, very pleasant for white since he only really has one weakness to concern himself with. Black is not doing so bad either in that respect. He has many pawns on dark squares, but he currently has 3 pawns on light squares, which is more than white. And what's worse is that we shall see as we take a look at the next few moves. White played king to g2, black played a6. We see that already black is placing a pawn on a light square. Now, it's understandable in part that black would wish to do this because white at any given moment may be able to, threaten some kind of an advance or he may try to use the b5 square to his benefit. But nevertheless, you have to be extremely careful when you play such moves as a6, because once again now, black fixes a pawn on a light square. So he has one fixed pawn on a light square, two fixed pawns on a light square, and white only has one. White now played the move queen to h5, and here I think black plays the losing move. He played the move queen to f7, which is understandable, just seeking to exchange the queens. However, it's a mistake, and it's a subtle one. Queen d7 would have put up far stiffer resistance, as the white king is basically going to be unable to join the game with the queens on the board. What I mean to say is that, for example, the white king might like to post itself on f4, right? I mean, if it could just be picked up and dropped onto f4, that would be a very good square. However, that's not an option because, or at least it's a very difficult option, a very risky option when the queens are on the board, because the further out that the king were to venture, let's say that if he played f3, pawn takes, king takes, and then king f4, well, you can already imagine queen e7 and queen e4 would be checkmate. So there is a big risk for white as he advances his king with the queens on the board. And I think that here, although black would have a couple of weaknesses, they would be so difficult to exploit for white that I think that with correct play, black should be able to hold the balance. Additionally, black would be toying with the possibility of a well-timed queen to a4, targeting some weaknesses here on the queen side. So for those reasons, I think that this would have been very difficult for white to win. However, the endgame that we're interested in is here. Queen f7, queen takes, king takes f7. And from this moment on, Lev Polugaevsky, the player with the white pieces, just played absolutely brilliantly. He begins with the move pawn to f3, which is logical because the idea is that this is the weakness. And, well, after playing the move f3, the threat is f takes e4, since f takes e4 would drop the bishop. Black is not in time to defend the bishop, and any bishop retreat away from this diagonal will drop the pawn on f5. Therefore, e takes f3 and king takes f3 is necessary. Now, on the one hand, white has slightly damaged his pawn structure by losing that pawn that used to be on f2, but the benefit is tremendous. King will go to f4 and pressure this f5 point. Now, the problem is black is very limited for choice here. Let's say that he plays the move king to g6. White will here just play the move king to f4, and now bishop goes to d7, and in this position, white has a beautiful tactical shot that just wins the game on the spot. Can you see what it is? Okay, so the move is bishop takes f5 check. After bishop takes f5, we notice that the king is attacking the bishop, the black king is defending it, but deflection is a possibility, h5 check. The black king is compelled to take the pawn or move back, and in any case, after king takes bishop, the resulting pawn endgame is a simple win for white, owing to the far superior king placement. So therefore, this is what I meant when I said that black is actually quite stuck for options here. If he simply plays king to g6 and tries to defend his weaknesses, there is this move, bishop takes f5, coming up next. The only way to actually stop this idea would be to now play the move pawn to h5 so that white doesn't have this h5 check deflection motif. Well, seeing this, the black player, Yuri Balashov, opted to just play, very understandably, h5 immediately. Now king f4 followed and king to g6. Now, black is setting a very sneaky trap here. In the event of the move pawn to e4, then after bishop to d7, let's say bishop takes f5 check, bishop takes f5, e takes f5, white has won a pawn but actually given away any winning possibilities, because black will simply play king g7 and after g4, trying to make progress, since every other area of the board is locked down. Then black will capture on g4, and after king takes g4, almost any king move will hold the balance. And now king goes to h6. Simply, there is no way to break into the black position. If white tries to push the pawn, then black simply steps back, and we will have this kind of back and forth here. So this would have been a draw. I should also point out that in the event of e takes f5 check, then after king to g7, let's say bishop g2, bishop a4, I just don't see how white can break down the opponent's position, because if in the event of bishop to f3, black can simply guard that pawn either with the bishop or with the king moving to h6. And yeah, sure, g4 is possible, but it's going to be the same situation here where I just don't see any way for white to progress. Therefore, well, king g6 is indeed a sneaky trap. In the event of e4, we would have a drawn position. But white instead resists this temptation and devises what I consider to be a really instructive winning plan of how to try and methodically exploit the potential weaknesses. Notice that this point on c4 is no longer a very significant weakness for white, because black is so tied down to the defense of his, he's so busy dealing with his own problems that he cannot find the time, 1 move, 2 moves, and 3 moves, in order to create a threat against the only white weakness. So therefore, white is very much free to arrange his pieces in the best fashion. Now, white plays the beautiful move bishop to f1, and at first sight this may seem kind of a difficult move to understand, but well, the point is that from here the bishop is only attacking the pawn on f5, and we know that the e4 tactical resource fails, so white may as well at the very least post his bishop on d3. The problem is that even once we're on d3, it would appear that after just bishop to d7 and back to c8 and so on and so forth, if we stay on this diagonal, black will simply stay on this diagonal in turn, leave his king posted here, and we will never be able to actually win the pawn. Well, turns out that there is a very, very nice detail contained in this position. Some of you may remember me discussing how one of the advantages that bishops possess over knights is that the side with a bishop against the side with a knight wishes to lose a tempo. They may do so. But if a knight wishes to lose a tempo, that's not going to be possible. And the reason for this is because let's imagine that we have a knight here on h8. That's its point of origin. And so it has to move, and it wishes to go, let's say, to f7 or to g6 on move 1. Then on move 2, it wishes to return to h8 and sort of hope that it's now, the tempo has been burned. But the problem is that's not the case, because if its point of origin is here on h8, on move 1, it moves anywhere else, and then on move 2, it returns. And that's an even number. If, for example, the knight goes here first on move 1, then on move 2 it goes here, on move 3 it goes here, on move 4 it goes here, on move 5 it goes here, on move 6 it goes here, and on move 7 it goes here, and suddenly on move 8 we're back, still an even number. The point is the knight cannot burn a move. In this way, we cannot sort of get the position with an odd number, which would represent, in this case, what this would mean is that we would be shifting our move onto our opponent, and so we could potentially use the concept of zugzwang in our favor. So now for comparison, let's consider a bishop. Well, its point of origin is f1, and it now, let's say, moves on to d3, and then on move 2, it can of course return to f1, but it could instead, after moving to d3, move to e2 on move 2, and then on move 3 only, return to f1. So bishops in general have the capacity to reposition themselves on the square that, represents their point of origin, on move 2 or on move 3 or on move 4, on an odd or an even number of moves. And this means that they generally have the power to pass the move to the opponent, unless of course the opponent also has a bishop and can, do likewise. Or any other piece, in fact, that has this capacity. But typically, when zugzwang as a concept becomes very powerful, it's in these endgames. And, endgames by definition mean that there's a very limited amount of material on the board. So we're usually not having heavy pieces on the board, except perhaps, one single heavy piece, in which case zugzwang tends to take on a lesser importance. With minor pieces, it's a very, very significant concept. But anyway, without digressing too much, to return to this particular position, what I think is really a subtle point, but a very, very instructive point, is that this bishop is not actually heading to d3, but instead, let's take a look at what happened. Black played bishop to d7, bishop to d3, bishop to c8, and instead, now white plays this very confusing move at first sight, which is the move bishop to b1. And so, well, I said to you that it wasn't actually heading to d3, but certainly b1 doesn't seem to be a very appealing square since, well, a2 is really a horrendous diagonal. And if you're going to be on this diagonal, why not be on d3, where you can flip back to e2 or f1, or perhaps even to c2 seems to make the most sense, where you can go to a4 as well as to d1. And certainly this diagonal is very, very appealing. And in fact, that explains the move bishop to b1. The point is that the black position is so tied down to these weaknesses that the king must stay on g6 and the bishop must stay on this diagonal. But if white, after the last black move bishop to c8, were to now play the move bishop to c2, black would respond with bishop to d7, preventing access to this diagonal. And here, if white dropped his king back, then by no longer having the king on f4, black would be free to move his own king and would have more ways of, let's say, making, more options for making a move. He could move the bishop or he could move the king. So therefore, what white wants to establish is this particular position here, this specific position where the white king is optimally placed, tying the black king down, and the white bishop is optimally placed as well, not only on this diagonal, but also on the d1 to a4 diagonal, because this square is a very important square. And of course, if you want to be on these two diagonals, then it's only the square that traverses both diagonals that interests you. There is no other square on the board where the bishop can be on precisely these two diagonals. And so we now understand the reason behind the move bishop to b1. White is looking to go to c2, but he doesn't want to go to c2 immediately, as that will be met by bishop d7. Instead, he wants to provoke black into playing, to force black into playing bishop to d7, and only now play bishop to c2, having burned the move, such that it's now black's move. And this is the point. Black is forced into making a concession here. He must now either move the king, in which case the f5 pawn falls, or he must abandon one of the two diagonals that the bishop is on currently. So the question that you might ask is, why can black not do the same and burn a tempo himself? And the reason is very subtle. If we notice this particular diagonal, the white bishop has 3 squares to navigate on, and as a result is able to burn a move. However, the black bishop that must stay on this diagonal, well, none of these squares are available to the black bishop, and it's only got, because of that space advantage, e6 is removed. Remember, we said that the space advantage is typically a significant advantage. Therefore, the black bishop only has c8 and d7 to move along. Therefore, it is like a knight in the sense that it cannot burn a move, because if its point of origin is c8, it must go to d7 on move 1, and then must be back at c8 on move 2, or, etc. Move 2 on move 4, on move 6. It's always going to be an even number. Therefore, bishop to d7 forced bishop to c2, and the maneuvering is nearly complete. Black facing the choice of whether to drop his f5 pawn or move his bishop, moved it back, and now bishop to a4 was played. So white has achieved the first stage of his plan. Now, that stage was to seize the a4 to e8 diagonal, but we should still ask ourselves, why is this so important? Well, take a look at the position. The black bishop is now paralyzed, having been deprived of the d7 square. It absolutely must not go back to b7, because that will be met by bishop to d7, not only winning the f5 pawn, but also locking this bishop out of the game. Therefore, the black king must move. This is the only possibility, and so it moves to f7. But this is important. It cannot move anywhere else but f7 because the e8 square is critical to control, since otherwise, in the event of, say, king to g7, white can now play bishop to e8, targeting the h5 pawn, and king to h6, defending the pawn, is forced, and now white can simply play the move bishop to f7. And here, white either will win this pawn if the black king moves, or otherwise can also win by playing for this move bishop to e6 at the right moment. So this position is completely hopeless. Therefore, after the move bishop to a4, as mentioned, king f7 is a necessity. And now what? Well, all of a sudden, white finds a very, very clever plan. He plays the move king to f3. Now, the point is not immediately obvious, but we will see it in the following line. Black now plays the move king to e7. It turns out that basically white wants to keep available this option of accessing e8, but also wants a second option, and so he's actually burning time with his king. Let's see what happens. King f2. And now black played the move f4, just simply giving up a pawn immediately. And this actually is maybe the best practical chance, but it is lost. So let's ask ourselves, let's try and figure out why black went for this. Turns out that in the event of king f7, white would continue with king moves. He would play king to e1. And this is the point. White now places his opponent's king in zugzwang. Having wasted several moves, or apparently wasted several moves with his king, the point is revealed. The black king was always seeking to perform two functions. Number one, cover the e8 square to prevent bishop e8 check. And number two, stay close enough to this h5 pawn, this h5 weakness, such that in the event of bishop to d1, black could meet it with king to g6. Now, let's take a look at the starting position when the king starts moving. Well, in this particular position, if white goes bishop to d1, now, indeed, king to g6. And, well, if white moves his bishop, then whatever king move occurs, white will no longer have the move bishop to d1. So black can, for example, play king to e7. He only has this task of defending on e8. Therefore, in this position, white simply wants to hand over the move to black. And since his bishop is paralyzed, and this particular pawn formation limits black's options, so by handing over the move, it's a lethal zugzwang. Therefore, white begins that process with king f3, and after king e7, turns out he needs to move the king again because the king is now standing in the way of the bishop. But of course, if in this position it had been an option to move elsewhere immediately, he would have done so. But king f3 was needed. Now king goes to e7, king f2 is needed. Now king returns to f7, let's say, and king e1 is needed. Why? Because once again, the black king is in an optimal square from where it can cover e8 and also access g6 or h6 to defend that h5 pawn. However, after king to e1, it's once again black to move, and this time around, if he wishes to defend e8, he must do so from either e7 or f8, but neither of these squares are close enough to the h5 pawn, so this would fall. So therefore, this is the explanation of king f8, bishop to d1. And if king g6, bishop e8 check, and after king h6, simply the king returns to f2. Well, what else to do? If you move the king, as we already saw, this pawn will fall. So bishop to b7, bishop to d7 now, king to g6, and king to f3. I think a beautiful king march and now triumphant return to the f4 square, after which f5 is falling. So I really think this is just a fantastic demonstration of the power of zugzwang, as well as, of course, a demonstration of how to win with that superior bishop, noting the advantage of space, noting the problems of pawns that can be targeted on light squares. This one too, although in this particular case it's not been an issue, noting as well that important detail about how weaknesses are not really weaknesses if they cannot be attacked. So this is important to keep in mind. Well, so therefore, instead, after king to f2, Balashov tries this move f4. Of course, Balashov, a very, very strong player, so he would have been aware of exactly what was going on. So therefore, Balashov tries the move f4, as he would have been very much aware of what exactly was, going on behind the scenes. But this proves insufficient. After g takes f4, white has gained that black pawn under very favorable circumstances. He was not forced to commit that pawn to e4, and so the white position is a lot more flexible. Black now played the move bishop to f5, and white plays king to e2. The white monarch marches over to defend the only easy pawns to target. Remember, that was something we had noted very early on. Black goes king to d8, and now white goes king to d2, a fantastic spot for the white king, because from here, the white king is close to defend on c4, but unlike from e2, it does not interfere along this d1 to h5 diagonal. Therefore, white has this possibility of bishop to d1 under certain circumstances, and additionally, the king on d2 covers that c2 square, so bishop to c2 may be an option. Bishop goes to g6, and now bishop to c6. Well, turns out that this pawn on a6 was a potential target after all. The black king is forced to return to c7, and now white goes king to e2. This is a very clever move because the black king is stuck to the defense of the a6 pawn, and this bishop has to be extremely careful of where it goes because white is threatening the possibility of bishop to e8 at any given moment. Black therefore tries to close up the position as much as possible. Also keep in mind that white has the idea of king f3 and a well-timed e4, maybe an additional option. So therefore, black decides to try and close up the position somewhat, although once again this is a light square target. Now Polugaevsky, very, very confident, he plays the very instructive pawn to e4, giving the pawn back. We now have a situation of material parity on the board, but after king to e3, notice that the only light squared weakness for white is this point, because of course d5 is safe unless c4 falls. Whereas for black, he suddenly has 3 pawns that are light squared targets and a very passive king compared to white's. Why is black's king passive? Precisely because of this weakness here on a6. He is tied down to the defense. Therefore, we can say that it actually only represents a temporary pawn sacrifice. For sure, white will be able to at least get e4 back. King goes to c8, bishop to a4, king goes to d8, and bishop to d1. The black king now is able to march over to the king side now that the a6 pawn is not being attacked, but he gets hit with a hammer blow. Polugaevsky plays f5 just in time, a brilliant move. The point is that it's a temporary sacrifice of a second pawn. After bishop takes f5, white wins the pawn on h5. And here we have another example of a central pawn versus a lateral rook's pawn. The outside passed pawn, as we referred to it, is very, very important pawn, more valuable than a central pawn is typically in endgames, since it will distract the king. And we will actually see this unfold over the course of the next few moves. There's another important detail about this exchange, which is that previously, if we just go back a couple of moves, let's say in this position here, we can see that the pawns here are locking down white's options. But after f5, bishop takes f5 and bishop takes h5, we suddenly begin to see that this diagonal is completely available, and although currently the black bishop is on f5, after the moves king f6 by black and king to f4 by white, a great move again, just activating the king, we see that white may be able to play the move bishop to g4, after which bishop c8 and targeting this pawn on a6 will just be lethal. And we notice as well a very important detail of the advantage of space, which is a subtle advantage is that, well, when you have more space, like white does here, in the event that the pawn on a6 falls, it's much more serious, much quicker for black, because this pawn is so close to promotion. If, for example, it were the dark squared pawn, the white a5 pawn that falls, then at least as a consolation, white would have the fact that this will take a long time. So white's threat is really very, very powerful. Bishop goes to h3, and now bishop to e2. It's still premature to go bishop to g4, because after bishop to f1, that weakness for white comes back to haunt him. Therefore, after bishop to h3, bishop e2 was played. Now bishop returns to f5. Well, otherwise white will simply grab the pawn on e4. So bishop to f5, and now bishop to g4. There is no possibility to play an attack against the c4 pawn, so black tried to move pawn to e3. The idea is that if bishop takes f5, it would be a terrible blunder after e2 with inevitable promotion. So therefore after e3, white is forced to play bishop e2. Nevertheless, the pawn is now very easy to capture, and so after bishop to d7, notice how black stays on this diagonal, just because otherwise this pawn is going to be a problem. King takes e3, and now black tries to activate his king. King goes to f5 and tries to keep the white king at the doors. White plays bishop to h5, once again activating his bishop, and still we note that this is a much more significant weakness than c4. Additionally, white has won a pawn. The king is forced to step back because the black light squared bishop is very, very limited for options, and also bishop f7 and bishop e6 check would be a lethal idea, since after bishop takes, pawn takes, king takes, we would have a situation where equal pawns, but after moves such as king e4, we note that that outside passed pawn would decide in favor of white. So therefore king f6 to control the f7 square primarily, but now king f4 occurs. Bishop f5. Balashov is certainly putting up a good fight, fighting against that weakness that white has. Bishop to e2, bishop to c2, and now king to e3. Beautiful timing, the bishop goes to f5, and now bishop to d3. Finally, white has placed his bishop on this diagonal instead, forcing bishop to g4. All king and pawn endgames are lost. Bishop to c2, bishop to h3, bishop h7, some maneuvering, bishop f1, bishop d3, bishop h3, and finally some progress, king f4. The bishop is now ideally placed, defending the weakness. The king has made progress, and the pawn will run up the board. Bishop to d7, h5, bishop a4, h6, bishop to b3, an exercise in futility as this bishop is perfectly placed to defend, h7, and now king g7. The point is, the black king is now forced to move towards the side of the board in order to babysit this pawn on h7. But the problem is that after this, Polugaevsky is able to walk his king into the black position, and suddenly all these pawns, d6, c5, and a6, will fall, since king e6 on the next move is unstoppable. Of course, black can take this pawn, but white simply is not concerned. King e6, check, king g7, king takes d6 with a trivial win. So that was actually an 87-move marathon game played in Leningrad, 1977, in the old Soviet championships. And really just, I think, a beautifully instructive bishop and pawn endgame. So hopefully, the main takeaways, watch where your pawns are, what color that they are on. Are they on the same color as your bishop? That's usually a bad idea because they block your bishop. And it also makes for easy targets for the opponent's bishop. Who has more space? Who has a weakness, but who has a greater number of weaknesses? And also perhaps note the fact that the role of the king and this concept of zugzwang take on great significance. The activity of the king and the possibility of using zugzwang in one's favor, these take on great significance in the event of endgames. And so black's early mistake was to believe that he was safer after queen to f7, challenging that white queen that was on h5 and getting the queens off the board. As a matter of fact, I think that this was the losing move. He should have avoided these endgames, because then zugzwang would not have been an issue with queens on the board, and also the terrible activity of the white king, which is just, as we can see in this final position, it's just crowns the victory for white. This would have been avoided, and perhaps black could have held his weaknesses. So anyway, this has been a very intensive look at bishops of the same color, but I hope you've learned a lot. Now we'll be moving on to bishops of opposite color, so I shall see you in the next video.